When do otherwise reasonable and intelligent people deny facts of reality? Well, when those facts clash with pre-existing emotions, desires, religious convictions, or ideological commitments. Let's consider IQ denialism. Because IQ is a highly heritable human trait that isn't distributed equally within or between populations, IQ science provokes denialist reactions. And it is the specific areas of IQ research that social and political activists find offensive that just happen to be the ones that are most vigorously protested and denied. The fact that IQs have been measured to be around 70 in much of sub-Saharan Africa is offensive to some people because 70 is a cutoff point for mental retardation.
The IQ test is not your average test. You can't study for it because it's supposed to measure things like how well you can reason or how well you can find relationships between seemingly unrelated things. The average score is 100. Lower than 70 indicates developmental delays.
Dr. Hayes-Hammer discovered that Alvin's IQ was 74 and he had dropped out of school in the 9th grade.
You have many people with low IQs who have had rap sheets as long as my arm. Alvin did not, so he was very naive to what was going on in the criminal justice system, and he also did not have the intelligence to be able to cope with the questioning by the police officers.
But Jennifer is different than others her age. Although she is 28 years old, she still lives at home and has an IQ of 71.
She was 28 in body, but not in mind. I would probably put her closer to about 14, 15.
He was a drifter. The guy had an IQ of 75, borderline dysfunctional.
He was low functioning in school. He had been in special ed from the time he started school.
Low functioning.
IQ, I think at 72 is what he's been measured at.
And what does that mean? How does he compare to a normal student?
Well, if the normal student is 100, then a 72 in our state, I believe that a 70 is the cutoff for mental retardation legally.
But it's the very far bar on that graph which has excited a lot of controversy, the IQ of 70.
Jeg oppsøker psykologen Richard Nisbet i New York. Han befinner seg på venstresiden av den politiske skalaen og har også forsket på rase og intelligens. Jeg lurer på hva han mener om Lynns forskningsresultater.
Actually, he said that people living in the Kalahari Desert, they were, by European standards, mentally retarded. Right?
So evidence for an IQ distribution with a mean of 70 for sub-Saharan Africa is denied. The deniers don't want to acknowledge it, so they insist that it just couldn't be true.
I mean, you just get some people, and you don't know who they are, and you test their IQs. If they really had IQs of 70, I mean, they wouldn't know why you plant in the springtime. They wouldn't know what a chief is. I mean, it's...
The society wouldn't work.
Right, that's right. You couldn't have a society composed of morons.
Here we have Richard Nisbet protesting the evidence for sub-Saharan African countries having average IQs of 70. This doesn't even pertain to heritability. This is just data on actual measured IQ scores. Nisbet doesn't offer alternative data. He just makes an a priori counterfactual assertion that African societies wouldn't function if the average IQ of their people were 70. But of course, by Western standards, African societies are dysfunctional.
Chepsebo grew up at the bottom of the Great Rift Valley of Kenya with 17 siblings, a coop full of chickens, and no running water.
In places like Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa that's vastly undeveloped.
People are so poor. Some of these villages make less than $1 a day, or it's basically subsistence living.
For places like this, a squalid squatters camp we found on the outskirts of the capital city, where hundreds of people survive in filth, hoping to find food or work. Their homes, a collection of sticks and cardboard.
Now it could be that with more testing and better sampling in more parts of Africa, you would arrive at an IQ estimate for Africa that is higher than 70. That's certainly a possibility. But the point is there's no reason to believe that the IQ average for Southern Africa couldn't be 70. And people who protest an average IQ of 70 for Sub-Saharan Africa because it sounds insulting don't seem to understand that a higher IQ score for Africa would actually strengthen the hereditarian case for racial group differences. Because it's pretty widely acknowledged that blacks living in Western countries have average IQs in the low to mid-80s. And so if we were able to assign an average IQ to Sub-Saharan Africa of 80, then we could conclude from that despite the dramatic differences in environment between Sub-Saharan Africa and advanced industrialized Western countries, it has only a negligible influence on IQ scores. And when Nisbet says that societies where half the people are morons with IQs at or below 70, when Nisbet says those societies couldn't work and therefore couldn't exist, he reveals his ignorance of how IQ scores have been progressing over time to reach the state where we are today. It's now commonly known as the Flynn effect.
Massive IQ gains over time. We get far more questions right on IQ tests than each succeeding generation back to the time that they were invented. Indeed, if you score the people a century ago against modern norms, they would have an average IQ of 70. Now, this has raised all sorts of questions. Were our immediate ancestors on the verge of mental retardation? Because 70 is normally the score for mental retardation.
Now, obviously, it wasn't people with IQs of 70 who designed the great buildings and wrote the great novels and made the great scientific discoveries that were made more than 100 years ago. But these high achievers did emerge from societies where the masses were largely low-functioning by today's standards. Why, comparatively, have so few high achievers emerged from African populations? Well, the answer may lie more in the distribution than the average. If Europeans have a slightly higher average distribution of innate cognitive capacity, then going out 2 to 3 standard deviations on the IQ bell curve, where most of the high achievers will be found, you will find a more extreme disproportionality between the European and the African representation at those levels. It's worth noting that while raw IQ scores have been rising due to factors such as better nutrition, earlier childhood development, environments that are more complex and more mentally stimulating, and greater emphasis being placed on test taking itself, there's also evidence that actual mental processing speed is on the decline. Meanwhile, there's no evidence that the racial gaps in the United States have been narrowing at all since the 1970s, and they may even be widening. The deniers cannot explain history, and they cannot explain the stark differences in European and African-derived civilizations that persist today. The deniers can't explain why, when, even after adjusting for socioeconomic status, the racial IQ differences in the United States and elsewhere still persist. When you categorically dismiss biological explanations a priori, when you try to reject an entire category of evidence from which you or someone else could honestly draw, then you are not being scientific. You are being a dogmatist. And some in the denier camp have even called for a ban, an actual legal ban, on critical thought as applied to the question of race and intelligence.
What do we mean by denial of science, or denialism, as it is increasingly being called? Like any pseudoscientific thinking, denialism begins with a desired conclusion. Rather than supporting a controversial or rejected claim, like many pseudosciences, denialists maintain that a generally accepted scientific or historical claim is not true, usually for ideological reasons. Denialists then engage in what is called motivated reasoning, rationalizing why the undesired claim is not true, or at least not proven. They therefore are working backwards from their desired conclusion, filling in justifications for what they believe, rather than following logic and evidence wherever it leads.
And it's obvious that deniers of race and IQ differences aren't deriving their conclusions from evidence. Rather, they are bringing their conclusions into the debate in advance of the evidence, and they are rendering their conclusions impervious to evidence. They adhere to a single fixed position. They will not acknowledge the existence of racial IQ differences that are driven in any part by biology. That is their position. But they know that they can't deny all the science pertaining to IQ and race, so they pick and choose, and they think that if they accept this section of science but reject this area, that they can give the appearance of having taken a carefully considered scientific position. And so what the deniers will end up doing is rendering their position untenable, either by accepting or conceding too much of the science, or by opposing and protesting things which are basically obvious. I never cease to be amazed by which crucial point any given race denier will nonchalantly concede on the one hand, not realizing that the concession collapses the whole artifice of a position he's advanced. On the other hand, I'm equally amazed, and often amused, by the petty and strange things deniers will try to protest. They all seem to have different strategies for resisting IQ evidence. If you were to aggregate their respective portfolios of doubt and acceptance into a single unit, you'd find that they've simultaneously accepted and rejected every piece of IQ evidence. They can't get their story straight, and even on an individual basis, none of them seem to be able to get their own stories straight. But for them, it's not about the evidence. That's not important to them. The only thing that matters to them is that they arrive at a rejection of a biological basis for racial IQ differences. And this is a problem with working backward from a preordained conclusion. You've already decided that you're going to reject something, but then you have to try to explain to somebody else why you've decided to reject it. Well, then you have to go back and construct rationalizations. It's like constructing a web of lies to try to deceive somebody. It's very hard for a liar to keep his story straight. One of the more mentally unhinged and at times amusing race deniers on YouTube goes by the name of Hannibal the Victor 13. And Hannibal has in the past constructed this bizarre conspiracy theory to explain why those of us who advocate for the recognition of racial realities do so. And he imagined that I and others were part of some secret plan to create a society like Sparta, where we would be the elites sitting at the top, ruling over everybody. Yes, that was his conspiracy theory. And Hannibal's peculiar form of IQ denial is rather silly. He holds the view that since IQ scores were originally created to identify people who are functioning at a subnormal level, that arbitrary line is the only thing that you can ever use IQ for. He says that while you can use IQ scores to differentiate people functioning at a level of 70 from people functioning at a level of 75, you can't say anything about a person functioning at an 85 IQ as compared to somebody functioning at an IQ of 135. There's just no difference. There's only this arbitrary cutoff point, and then after that, you can't say anything. So he accepts IQ only up to a certain level of the bell curve. It has meaning. But then anything further to the right of that arbitrary cutoff point is meaningless. Another very strange form of IQ denial came from a user named Integral Math, or I think as he's known now, Justicar. He insisted that you could not arrive at an estimate for IQ heritability until you defined what intelligence means, which, of course, he asserted was impossible. So that was his way of preemptively denying any and all IQ heritability estimates by raising this philosophical objection over the definition of intelligence, which would be like saying that you can't infer the heritability of total body mass until you define what fatness means or what thinness means. All these deniers at an individual level have their own peculiar ways for coping with and maintaining and protecting their denialist position. One of the leading race deniers on YouTube before he fell from grace was EvoGen Videos, and throughout my debates with him, I noticed that EvoGen would actually make a lot of concessions, and he would change his positions on particular aspects of the evidence. For example, he initially insisted that when controlling for socioeconomic status, the racial gaps disappeared. Well, I pointed out that that was false, that was well known to be false, and yet he didn't change his position. He continued to deny that there was any biological basis for the racial IQ differences, and he offered no explanation for why, when controlling for socioeconomic status, the gaps still persist. Under his assumptions, the gaps would close. Under his environmentalist assumptions, the gaps should have closed. So he should have altered his position in light of the fact that the assumptions that he held did not in fact predict reality. In fact, they predicted something that we do not observe in reality. And then later, EvoGen accepted the mainstream scientific viewpoint on general IQ heritability. He accepted that IQ was about 75% heritable. Of course, he didn't really understand what the term heritability meant. If you are going to deny that genetic variation plays any role in shaping any extent of any of the group IQ differences within a country, whether they be between blacks and whites or between East Asians and Hispanics, then acknowledging that IQ variation overall within that country is 75% conditioned by genetic variation within that country pretty much undoes your position. It renders it untenable.
Denialism has the same problem that we described previously with pseudoscience in general, the so-called demarcation problem. The line between denialism and healthy skepticism. It's a similarly fuzzy line as that between pseudoscience and legitimate science. There is a continuum, in fact, between these two extremes, with only a very fuzzy border in between. But also, like pseudoscience, there are a number of behaviors that characterize denialism. The more of these behaviors one is engaging in, the more towards the denialism end of the spectrum they are. While the labels are often convenient, skeptic versus denier, I don't want to get caught up in the semantics of this issue. Again, what's important is to focus on the specific behaviors that are denialist behaviors or strategies, and versus those that are legitimate scientific behaviors. So let's get to the strategies of denial. What types of cognitive flaws and behaviors mark a belief system or a behavior as denialism? The primary one, I think the bread and butter of denialism, is moving the goalpost. Always demanding more evidence for a claim than is currently available. When that burden of evidence is met, then simply move the goalpost back further and demand even more evidence. This is related to another denialist strategy called the unreasonable demand for evidence. So as new evidence comes in, you can always nudge back the goalpost, keeping just out of range of whatever evidence is provided. But you can also simply begin by making a demand for evidence that you know can never be provided.
And deniers of the heritability of intelligence, especially as it pertains to group differences, will often make the unreasonable demand that the specific genes responsible for intelligence be identified.
Robert Plomin has spent 20 years looking for the particular genes that affect intelligence. But it's been a frustrating search.
We don't know how many genes we're talking about. And if there are very, very many, they're going to have very, very small effects and be very, very difficult to find. But I think these genetic differences, when they're expressed, are going to show up throughout the brain.
Well, of course, intelligence is a polygenic trait, and the specific genes and gene interactions responsible for it are as yet unknown. And the people who say that you gotta find the genes before you can make a heritability estimate know full well that they are making a demand that is impossible to meet, and it is not necessary to meet.
You know, that this is one of the most highly heritable characteristics around, intelligence. In adults, we're talking about at least 50 or 60% of the variance in the population is due to genetic differences among us.
Arbitrary gene demanding is a denialist stratagem that has been employed on YouTube by The Skeptical Heretic and Sophia Roon, among others.
Evolution is a similar example in that evolution deniers may say, show me one fossil that proves that evolution happened. Well, of course, no such fossil can possibly exist. Evolution is a pattern of events, a pattern of evidence.
A form of evolution denial is race denial. Race deniers insist that evolution did not forge any meaningful changes in the cognitive mechanisms of the various human populations that evolved in different parts of the world over the past 50 to 100,000 years. Race deniers typically won't come out and deny evolution explicitly. Instead, they'll advance an even more absurd position. They'll say that yes, humans evolved, but when we branched off into different parts of the world and adapted to our respective environments, one organ, the brain, did not adapt. They'll call it stabilizing selection, which is not a term that applies globally to all environments, but in any event, when presented with evidence that in fact regional variations in brain size and shape have developed among human populations, they'll have to manufacture another ad hoc explanation for why brain functioning exists totally independent from brain size and shape.
Yet another common, very common tactic or strategy of denialism is to dismiss entire categories of accepted scientific evidence. For example, deniers may cite the logical fallacy of confusing correlation with causation. Remember, I discussed this in a previous lecture, that we cannot assume that because two things are correlated, that therefore one causes the other. It's possible, for example, you can't assume A causes B. Maybe B causes A, or maybe some other third thing, C, causes both A and B. So therefore, it is true that the assumption of causation from correlation is a logical fallacy. That does not mean that we can dismiss all evidence of correlation. Correlation still is evidence. We can, for example, use multiple different types of correlation in order to make very high probability inferences about a causal connection. Otherwise, the entire field of epidemiology, the study of disease incidence and the pattern of diseases that occur in the world and in the community, would go away. It would be worthless if correlation was of no scientific value.
Brain size has about a 0.4 correlation with IQ. In the past, deniers have tried to dispute either the evidence for different brain size ranges between populations, or the correlation between brain size and IQ. and some of the less informed deniers still do engage on these issues that have been settled by science for decades. But deniers who are more familiar with the science know they can't raise much in the way of empirical objections to it. Instead, they raise a philosophical objection, that correlation doesn't equal causation and therefore tells us nothing. We've seen this form of sophistry from the skeptical heretic. He was willing to dismiss essentially all science that infers causation from consistent patterns of correlation. These are the lengths to which deniers will go in order to avoid acknowledging any slight racial variations in cognitive capacity.
The core property that renders a science legitimate is that it engages in hypothesis testing. It generates testable hypotheses that make predictions that can be practically and theoretically falsified.
I've advanced a specific, testable hereditary hypothesis for the black-white racial IQ gap in the United States. I hypothesize that the black-white IQ gap is about 80% genetic in origin and 20% environmental. I believe this apportionment accounts for the consistency and persistency of the IQ gaps and can be used to successfully predict IQ distributions from known racial and environmental circumstances in a given area. I've repeatedly asked the skeptical heretics, Sophia Roon, Astriacow, Hannibal, and others in the YouTube denialist camp to offer alternative hypotheses of their own that we can test. They've all refused. They insist that they're not ideologically tethered to an implausible 0% genetic, 100% environment model for racial IQ gaps, but they refuse to identify any figure or range of figures they would consider more plausible. Ostensibly, they have no position other than to deny that any heritability estimate, whether it's 80%, 50%, 1%, 99%, or 0%, can be judged to be more plausible than any other. Either they know nothing about the subject, or they are feigning ignorance in support of a denialist agenda. These are the lengths to which deniers will go in order to avoid acknowledging any slight racial variations in cognitive capacity.
Yet another strategy is to use facts out of context. That gives one the ability to marshal a lot of facts that make it seem like there is a compelling or a strong reason to call into question a specific claim or scientific theory. But each fact is not being put into its proper context.
There's a study of Chicago school children, black school children who had extremely high IQs, genius-level IQs. Now, if there's a big genetic difference between the races, it just would have to be the case that these kids are going to be the ones who have a higher fraction of European genes than the black population in general. And that's not true.
So what deniers will do is cherry pick. They will take one study that seems to suggest something different than what virtually all of the other studies have shown, and use that one study as evidence that all the other science is wrong. For example, James Flynn cites the Eifforth study as evidence that the black-white IQ gaps can narrow to virtually zero. But the problem is, this study was conducted decades ago. It was a very small sample from a very select group of people, and the results have never been duplicated by subsequent studies. So this particular study is what we would call an outlier. But if you're a denier, or perhaps more charitably for Flynn, if you're engaging in wishful thinking, then you'll take something out of context like that and make it out to be much more than it really is. And then Richard Nisbett cites one particular study conducted in one particular school which purports to find that blacks with low white admixture do just as well, if not better, than blacks with a high degree of admixture. And so Nisbet draws this sweeping conclusion from this one study that mulattoes in general don't have higher IQs than blacks, and he further claims that this means that there can be no genetic basis for the black-white IQ gap. So Nisbet has these grandiose conclusions that he's trying to impose on pretty flimsy evidence that doesn't warrant them.
Now, if European genes are superior to black genes, then it ought to be the case that those blacks in this country with more European genes, and some blacks have literally mostly European genes, ought to be brighter than those who have purely African genes. There's not a shred of evidence that this is true.
Nisbet just sweeps aside the totality of the evidence, which shows pretty consistently that mulattoes score in between whites and blacks. This has been shown in South Africa. This has been shown in regional studies of the United States, where white admixture among blacks is lowest. Blacks tend to have the lowest IQs, mainly in the Southeast. It's been shown in adoption studies where mixed-race children adopted into middle-class families perform better than black children adopted into similar families. So when somebody attempts to draw a sweeping, ready-made conclusion from an outlier study, that's a pretty good indication that the person is suffering from cognitive bias.
Can brain size really be correlated with IQ? Richard Nisbet has looked into this and come to a very different conclusion.
Have you, in your findings, seen things to show that there is no causal relationship between brain size and intelligence?
I consider the whole brain size issue to be a red herring.
And Nisbet isn't just some random egalitarian hack whom I'm trying to make look bad. Nisbet has written books on the subject of intelligence. Nisbet is cited as an expert on the subject of race and IQ by other egalitarians. And yet, as we've seen, he doesn't even understand the Lynn Flynn effect. And as a consequence, he doesn't believe that it's possible for societies with average IQs of 70 to exist. And he's either ignorant or feigning ignorance of admixture studies that pretty consistently contradict his position.
Deniers often combine their program of doubt with the false dichotomy. I mentioned this specifically with the conspiracy theories in the previous lecture. If the accepted version of events is not true, then their alternate claim or version must be true. That's often, in fact, the motivation behind denying a specific science. It's because the deniers have an alternative that they are really promoting. This, however, is nothing more than an argument from ignorance combined with the false dichotomy logical fallacy. What they rarely do is provide positive evidence that supports their alternative claim. If they could do that, that's what they would be doing. But since they don't have the evidence to support their claim, they must resign themselves to attacking the accepted scientific alternative. And when all else fails, simply claim that there's a conspiracy. In this way, denialism and conspiracy thinking are related. This is yet another way in which there is a connection between the two. The ultimate fallback position for the denier is the conspiracy theory. When the evidence does not support their position, they will simply claim that the scientific evidence itself is all a fraud, a grand conspiracy, usually of their ideological opponents. This allows them to dismiss all that pesky evidence, all the published studies that prove that the science they do not want to acknowledge. In the end, denial is just another form of pseudoscientific thinking. Deniers violate multiple principles of critical thinking, logic, and scientific methodology because of their a priori beliefs.
So conspiracy mongering is something that some race and IQ deniers engage in. They'll ascribe nefarious origins or motivations to the arguments made by racial realists, almost always without evidence. They'll make reference to invisible forces like white privilege or institutional racism or social dominance orientation to try to imply that the racial IQ hierarchy, with Asians and Ashkenazi Jews at the top and blacks at the bottom, is the result of an oppressive web of social constructs rather than evolution and inheritance. So a grand conspiracy theory fills a void for the denier. It provides the denier with a totalizing, non-biological explanation for why racial IQ variances are so consistent and persistent. And because the denier believes that there are nefarious forces causing these undesirable racial disparities, the denier seeks people to blame, scapegoat, and demonize, and so the denier will be imbued with an exaggerated sense of moral outrage and will unleash it in the form of histrionic denunciations of people merely for doing scientific research. I give you David Suzuki.
I do not believe that we should dignify this man and his ideas in public debate. I am outraged. I am outraged at these monstrous claims. Where are those hotshot molecular geneticists whose work he's citing, who gladly go for grants on biotechnology but don't get up when it comes to an important social issue? In allowing him to continue his work and spread his ideas, in providing research funding, in allowing his articles to be published, scientists and scholars legitimate his work and must be condemned for a serious dereliction of responsibility. You see, there will always be Rushtons in the world, and we must always be prepared to root them out and not hide behind academic freedom. But to deal with these matters implies that there is a proper question, that he's a legitimate question to his work, and there isn't. Over these data, they simply are not worth dwelling on because they seem to give legitimacy to what he's claiming. His claims must be denounced, his methodology discredited, his grant revoked, and his position terminated at this university.
Generally, we resist changing our beliefs. The psychological studies show that we marshal a lot of cognitive energy in order to maintain what we already believe and what we want to believe. A little bit of motivated denial can save us from a lot of cognitive dissonance.
The IQ test has lasted so long because it's got an almost magical property. It seems to show that we have one general all-round ability, a kind of all-purpose thinking skill, that can be represented by a single number, the IQ score. Very convenient if you want to compare people.
Wow, that was tough. That's tough. Did a lot of people get this one in 2 minutes?
I can't see how that works.
On average, if we're good at one of these sections, we tend to be good at all of them. And from this comes the idea that intelligence is some kind of general, all-round ability. To the professionals, it's now known by a single small letter, G.
If you study psychology, you'll find that among the most impressive quantitative results have to do with G. The results are stable once you reach about late adolescence. Okay, if you try to correlate the G score at age 10 or something with adult G score, it's somewhat noisier. But by the time you reach late adolescence, it's quite stable. Reliability correlation is about 0.9. The results are pretty predictive. I'll talk about that a little bit in some of the subsequent slides. And we know from various studies, twin adoption sibling studies, that it's quite heritable. Okay, and usually people get really upset about 0.3.
Many intellectuals are skeptical about the existence of intelligence. Perhaps the most famous is Stephen Jay Gould, who in the book Mismeasure of Man argued that the notion of general intelligence was a myth. And he's convinced many people that that is the state of the art. Now, I find this actually rather remarkable, that so many academics would deny the existence of intelligence. I think this is part of a larger repugnance among intellectuals to any genetic explanation of anything. I've written a book on this topic, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, how the idea that any aspect of human talent or temperament has any biological basis has often been seen as politically and morally and emotionally incendiary in most of the 20th century. And in the book I tried to analyze how one can sensitively deal with discoveries of a biological basis of human personality and intelligence, including possible discoveries about the genetics of group differences. I think it's safe to say that the current approach, or at least the approach in recent decades, was to deny the existence of intelligence. I mentioned the mismeasure of man as the foremost example. To deny the existence of genetically distinct human groups. There's a widespread myth that there is no such thing as race whatsoever, that that it's purely a social construction.
Now, social constructivists imagine that by denying a biological basis for race, they can then thwart scientific investigations into biological differences between populations. But of course, you can still measure biological differences in the distributions of skin color or brain size or other traits between groups of people categorized on any basis. Zip code, income, or language, for example. Language is a social construct. It's not a biologically inherited trait, and it's not a valid biological category. Yet, speakers of Swahili might have a different IQ distribution than speakers of Japanese. Swahili speakers might show a different distribution in skin tone and cranial capacities as compared to speakers of Japanese. So we can measure IQs, measure biological differences, and gauge environmental differences, and put the evidence together and come up with an estimate for the heritability of any difference in average IQ between the two groups, regardless of whether the two groups are considered races or not. The postmodern race deniers' fixation with putting race in deconstructionist quotation marks doesn't strip the racial categories that are in common use today of the biological correlates that have been shaped by ancestry. In other words, deniers can't make racial realities go away by means of linguistic sophistry. So instead, they seek to impede our ability to communicate the story of human evolution and how it affects us today.
Obviously, the Christian right denies evolution because it threatens the creationist account, but the left has denied evolution, certainly since the 70s. Well, nobody denies that it happened for other animals, and nobody denies that evolution shaped our bodies. Nobody on the left denies this. But when Ed Wilson suggested that it also seems to have shaped human behavior, whoa! You're opening the door to saying there could be sex differences, there could be race differences. And since what the left sacralizes is equality and anti-racism, they plant their stake in the ground. They say there are no sex differences, there are no race differences.
So one way to disbelieve something or to reject it, basically, is not to say that it's flat out false, but to set the bar so high, basically, that nobody can.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that happened for evolution, sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, anything that suggested sex differences, anything that suggests race differences. So if you know what a group holds sacred, you see where they go crazy. You see where they go crazy. Go crazy.